We are the Katarowki Learning Centre, and we're an alternative education site. We have about 220 students, and about 35% of those self-identify as Indigenous. Within our site, we have the River program, which is our Indigenous program for grade 9 and 10s in the Limestone District School Board.
So our age range is quite wide, and we offer, we are one site that offers basically the mission of providing an avenue for people to earn their high school diploma. That's who we are serving in the public school system. But we have got some different ways of doing that. So as a whole site, we're Katarowki Learning Centre, and as you've heard, it's open for students of all ages, from 14, 15, 16, all the way up to 73. Now within that, we realize that some of those age groups have different needs. So we've got a specialized program for grade 9s and 10s, which is a classroom in and of itself with 2 staff who are directly working with those students at all times and who deliver an integrated package of courses.
We also work with in partnership with the Métis Nation of Ontario, who helps to support our River program that we have here for the grade 9 and 10 students. And then as well as that, there's also cultural activities that are built into the programming at the site. So we have lots of cultural activities that happen almost on a weekly basis, and all the students are able to enter those cultural activities. And we also have some activities that are geared towards more age-specific groups or towards male or female, but usually most of our programming is open to all the students here. So for the River program, the aim of the program is to provide a safe space for Indigenous students to come to, where there's Indigenous content and knowledge kind of integrated cross-curricular into the classroom. So there's direct instruction for classes per semester, and we try to do project-based learning where the students are participating in different projects or activities, and the curriculum meets the expectations are met through the project of these cross-curricular classes.
So I'd say I'd answer these questions about target audience and aims in sort of a similar way, and that's that we have, our target audience is everybody who walks in the door. And what we are trying to do with everybody who walks in is give a sense of, through our programming that's curricular and non-curricular, give an understanding of our shared history together and our shared present and our shared future. And so we do that through our cultural activities that are non-curricular. We do that through our curricular activities that are often project-based or land-based and that involve community building, where there's all kinds of chances to share stories, backgrounds, and history and culture, and our goal is to build this shared understanding and experience every day, and not to just treat different groups of people differently, and to treat experiences as one-offs that are done and then finished, and then we move on to the next experience. But that the audience of everybody, Indigenous and non-Indigenous students in our school, meets with our purpose, which is Indigenous culture and curriculum-linked activities woven throughout our activities on a daily basis, and then seasonal and monthly and yearly.
I think one of the things that makes our program pretty special is that we have a lot of supports for the grade 9 and 10 Indigenous students that come here that need to be in a more culturally supported environment. And then we also have a lot of opportunities for those students once they get older and they join the alt site. That's part of the bigger site here. So by opening up the doors for them, it's not limiting. They have a place where they feel well supported. They may have attended in grade 9 and 10, and then they're moving on to grade 11 and 12. We can't accommodate them in that program anymore, but we can still accommodate them at the site, where they still can access the cultural supports. They can still access some of the same teachers and support people. And we've found that it's been good for those students, because then they're more willing to try the expanded opportunities that are available to them. So we have dual credits, we have the college programs that are available, and we have a lot of students participate in those because they have access so much support here. I think the other thing that's neat about our site is when we work with a lot of the Indigenous students, we focus a lot on community building, about getting to know resources in the community, the wider community, and about relationship building. And I think what we've learned is that for a lot of students who have been disengaged from the mainstream system, that a lot of the supports that we were using with our Indigenous students are good for all of the students. So we've opened up a lot of the community building activities that we did with our Indigenous students to non-Indigenous students as well. And by doing that, we're offering more supports to those students in a good way, like, building relationships, getting to know people, building community. But also at the same time, they're learning about reconciliation because they're building relationships with the Indigenous students and they're participating in activities together, they're participating in cultural events together, and so they're building those relationships. And so what we find is that people are more apt to participate in the reconciliation process when they know people who are Indigenous, when those students have had to work together on projects or when they've had shared experiences, then they often have a better understanding. The mutual empathy and understanding is more present because they know each other. It's not a course where it's talked about and then it's over and then they don't come back to it. It's kind of like in our daily and weekly practice here that we have things happening and everybody's coming to them and they're building community and they're building relationships with each other on a weekly basis. I think there's always the specific measurements that come from being in a school. So we measure credit attainment and we measure attendance and things like that. But one of the other things that we've consistently been trying to do is measure those alternate metrics of success that we always talk about that are really important to our students. And often the credit and attainment and attendance don't come until they've come and they've accessed housing support, or they've come and they've accessed mental health or addiction support, or they've come and they've made a friend and they feel like they can walk into the class and they feel like they're comfortable, they feel like they're represented in the school. All of those things have to be met before we see any difference in the credit attainment or attendance. So that's a lot of times where we start, and we think about it like a medicine wheel, like you start in the beginning in the east and you have to meet those needs first. Like we talk about what are the needs that you have to meet at the beginning of your journey. Like you have to make sure the wellness, and you have to make sure mental health, and you have to make sure housing, and you have to make sure you have food. And we have a breakfast and lunch program here, and we find a lot of our students you have to take care of all those things first. And sometimes a student, it might not be reflected in their attendance or their credit attainment, but the fact that they've filled out a housing application, they've accessed a mental health worker, and they've had something to eat, and they've come for an hour, it's huge, right? And we have students who missed 70 days from the previous year, and then all of a sudden they're coming 3 times a week. That's a huge success. So we always think about what kind of metrics we're looking for and then how we can start measuring them in a better way.
So one metric that we do track is engagement, and we've been tracking that for a couple of years now, and we've seen that there's a pretty strong correlation between engagement in a non-curricular activity and then success in terms of credit attainment. And for us, that's been about 3 times the rate of attainment for engaged students as opposed to students who we are not able to engage in one of a huge range of activities. So it could be something like participating in an intramural sports, it could be showing up for workshops, engaging with a counselor who comes to our site, going on a field trip, and there would be lots of other examples. But even if we can just get one little foot in the door and even a tiny bit of engagement, that really we see leads to greater success academically as well with those metrics that the school board is looking for: attendance, achievement, and attainment. My understanding, which keeps changing, but my understanding is that above all, Indigenous education is first asking the question of what a learner needs. And where they're at. And so we do our best to try to meet a student where they're at. To me, it also means forming a community of learning and making the student feel a part of that, as opposed to the way that we sometimes look at education as a verb that's done to people. I'm an educator, I educate people. We're an educational institution here. We're part of a community, and we, as much as we can, bring that community in at all levels. So at the levels of the people who we think of as learners, typically the students, the younger people, or the adults who are looking for education here, but then also looking at their supports and how they can support educating them, how they are educating them, and valuing that in any ways that we can, formally and informally. So those are some of the things that I think of as being as Indigenous education. I also think that there's connections with, like creating a community of teachers and learners, people together at the school. So really focusing on what that means to be a part of the community, and recognizing that there's people in our community who don't know how to be part of one yet. So providing opportunities at many different entry points, as well as explicit instruction on what it means to be a community member, how it is to make a friend, how it is to resolve a conflict, how it is to show interest in something. I think another aspect could be that aspects of cultural education, and that there's a lot of values and values that people bring that need to be reflected in the curriculum and in the approach of different teachers. So and community members who are in the school, so finding ways of involving those voices, and that can be through asking directly for their students, just creating openings, so open houses where people are invited to bring their families in, field trips where students are invited to bring families so that we see who comes, and then we're not asking formally, but we're just slowly building these networks and these relationships, and then going from there, but not starting with the request before we have the relationship. And then I think finally just an aspect of getting outside and being on the land, going to communities where Indigenous people live, whether that's in our city or outside of it, and asking them what it is they'd like to share with our students.
I think it's a lot about experience too. I think there's a big difference in teaching about Indigenous content and then teaching to Indigenous students. I think a lot of the struggle that we've had in the past is when we've been working with our Indigenous students, it's hard to use the curriculum to teach Native studies to Indigenous students, because sometimes it feels like we're teaching about Indigenous people. And I think the way that it's different for me is that when we're working with Indigenous students, we're working with them, and we're working it's okay. We're working with the students, and we're trying to do what's best for them. And sometimes when you're working with a group of Indigenous students, teaching them about residential school from the curriculum perspective, isn't the best way to do it. Whereas maybe going to somebody's house or listening to somebody speak, we had a survivor and his wife come in one time, and they spoke to our students in a way that, it wasn't like following the curriculum, but it was a much more meaningful experience for our students. So I think there's a big difference in teaching about, teaching a Native Studies class and working with Indigenous students. And I think we had a conversation yesterday about one student in particular who is on university track and might take 6 to 8 years to get there, but she's doing it in her own way, and how we as an institution can't make her conform to what we think should be the pathway for her. You get it done in 4 years and you do these courses one right after the other. It has to be the institution conforming to her and to her needs, and valuing her outside life experience and the time that she takes off to school to spend with her family and to take care of her grandmother. And part of Indigenous education is making sure that we are accommodating Indigenous learners and their experiences, and making sure that the education kind of fits around them and supports them, instead of making her conform to how the institution should be run or thinks it should be run.
Part of our vision over the next 10 years is widening the community. So, our first step was building a community that people would feel comfortable in and would gain the skills to move on to the next step. So thinking of that as expanded opportunities like apprenticeship and college and other post-secondary options. But we're in our own bubble here, and we're in our own world, and we're a place that students can come back to. But I think the next step for us is to create a community that goes across our school board and within and between a lot of the different institutions that that affect students and that they work with within our city, so that they're part of a bigger community and they'll have that many more options.
I think for me in the next 10 years, there's going to be a lot of focus on authenticity and what it really means to be in Indigenous education. I think as Indigenous people, we have to do a lot of thinking about that ourselves and what we want it to look like, because I think there's a lot of push to make it bigger and bring it in to classes in different ways. But I think we really need to be conscious of how we're doing that and make sure that we're doing it in the right way. I think the authenticity piece for me, because we're in an urban setting, we have a group of Indigenous students, and often we would have anywhere between 8 and 10 different nations represented in one classroom. So trying to make it authentic in terms of meeting the needs of the students that we have in front of us, but also avoiding the pan-Indigenous view of making everything, everybody believes this or everybody does it this way. Like, we have to be really careful about the authenticity piece and make sure that we're also including the urban context and experience in Indigenous education, because I think too there's a lot of research and there's a lot of awareness about Indigenous education in groups, like in communities, where there's access to language and culture, and there's people that can do a lot of ceremonies and bring a lot of perspective in the classrooms. And then we have this urban context where 50% of Indigenous youth are in the urban context and often don't have the same access to land base or community or culture or language that they belong to, and often don't know where they belong. So I think we really need to look at what does that mean in the urban context? What is authentic Indigenous education in an urban context, and where do we get it from, and how do we meet the needs of our students and make it relevant to our students and to everybody in the community, and focus on local histories and people and communities, but also not lose the authenticity.
I think, even just to echo on some of the things that you just said, Kelly, but and have talked about elsewhere, but I think that like going forward nationally especially, there has to be this difference between the rhetoric about like we as Canadians and our Indigenous partners, or however it's looked at, and that's not everybody may feel that way. Maybe there's people on either side who think that there's that there needs to be a difference. But I think that going forward, like it is one future that we all have together, and it is our shared history. So, and many of us in our own families have been on both sides of the history, and certainly all of us together need to understand where what our common interests are, and they lie in an honest retelling of history, and in a focus on our shared goals
And a shared future.
Mm-hmm. So to that end, like nationally, I mean, curriculum and education is typically a provincial initiative, but there's room, certainly in our province of Ontario, and probably nationally, for new lenses on how curriculum is developed and how the language and the approach of that us versus them, which I think is really deeply ingrained into the curriculum, needs to change. And it's not about Canada and Native relations. It's Indigenous relations, and it's past with Indigenous people. It's about Canada's past. It's about or it's about the past of all the people who now live in Canada. However it's framed, it has to be an understanding that we need to get away from this dichotomy that still somehow permeates a lot of language.
I think continued support in terms of, from a ministry level, recognizing places of community as educational institutions and limiting the barriers that have been limiting barriers to creating community spaces. I think the most successful work we've done has always been in partnership with a community organization. And so the more that the educational institutions can support and accommodate this community building, honorariums to bring people in, because we can't do it all ourselves either, and valuing the knowledge that community members bring in to the school. I also think support for these types of institutions where there's a lot of focus on Indigenous education and on Indigenous content and projects, like a lot of support that recognizes that they're valuable and that they're places where students should all spend part of their time in high school.
I think there are also some other like non-financial barriers that could be removed, and some of those would be like reducing some of the institutional barriers to involving community people. So that would be like expediting the way in which, like allowing honorariums for elders to be paid, expediting and being flexible about the ways that that's being able to happen. So that there's a cultural understanding that there's not necessarily money for a service, but there's a gift that is going to be given before service is provided, or not service is the wrong word, but that there's going to be a gift that's provided before, as a recognition of respect for the knowledge that's going to be shared. And those two haven't come together yet. I think another thing that's needed for to make things improve in the future is like a focus on the people who are already in the educational institutions, right? So like teaching is a fairly old profession, and I do believe that we're going to be in a different world when our kids who are already in primary school become the teachers of tomorrow. But I think that they're going to go to university, and already in some places there's a mandatory course on Indigenous studies. They already have a different understanding of the history of this land than we did or than I certainly did as a non-Indigenous person growing up. I think they're going to be different teachers in the future, but I think that the people who are going through the system now need opportunities for learning, and those are becoming available through institutions like initiatives like this one. But that's another sort of non-funding related way in which school boards can adapt, is by shifting the focus of their teacher training to recognize the fact that there's a knowledge gap and an experience gap, and so to reallocate some of their existing PD resources to Indigenous education.